Hello, my name is Alexander Harriman, and today we're going to be talking about the costs of how hard a pitcher throws ball four, and look at whether having outlier velocity on individual pitches affects that pitcher's command, or if it really isn't that bad to just throw hard. Now, throwing hard typically is better in baseball, in particular for fastballs, but maybe not everyone agrees with that sentiment. Nationals general manager Mike Rizzo would be one of them. And before the 2024 season, he said in a preseason interview that he doesn't care how fast his prospects and his pitchers throw a ball four. And he meant it. Here on screen, you see a video posted by the Nationals organization that includes a snippet of one of the dozen or so signs saying, I don't care how fast you throw a ball for everyone to see in spring training. And it caught a lot of attention, that sentiment, although Mike Rizzo probably had a reason to think that maybe he didn't want his pitchers to be throwing hardball fours, because he had one of the youngest pitching staffs in baseball in 2023, and they allowed a lot of walks, the seventh most in the league. And perhaps even more concerning for him was not the walks, but the fact that they loved allowing home runs right down the middle of the plate. An MLB leading 71, which you see flashing on your screen here in this video. Now, not everyone would agree that command is the only thing that matters, and there are plenty of counterexamples too, with Aroldis Chapman perhaps being one of the best counterexamples to Mike Rizzo's argument. He has long been a flamethrower in his 15-year career and has rarely cared where the ball has went. In fact, as you see, he has had a bottom 5 percentile walk rate 6 times since Baseball Savant started tracking pitches in 2015, and he's done so every year in the last 4 years. In the last 4 years, he has won a World Series with the Rangers, and you see his 2023 percentile rankings here. Having watched him blow multiple games and perhaps even the AL West for the Rangers in 2023, I get the sentiment Mike Rizzo's going for. But at the end of the day, you can't argue with the fact that sometimes if you throw fast enough, you are extremely successful. And many organizations in college and the pros basically value velocity over command and control of your pitch. Which begs the question, does it truly matter how hard you throw a ball four? Is velocity the end all be all, like it is for most Stuff Plus models and other evaluators of pitch quality, or does the command drop off for throwing hard actually cost a pitcher in his command? So, how are they going to measure this? Well, I decided to take the approach of looking at every pitcher in Major League Baseball and looking at his outlier pitches. So I gathered all the data for every pitcher season between 2022 and 2024 inclusively, and I did include the playoffs in that data. Every fastball thrown at least 500 times in that season was included in the study. That includes multiple fastballs for if a pitcher threw multiple archetypes more than 500 times. So if a pitcher threw 700 four-seamers and 600 sinkers, they're both included. Anything that was thrown less than 500 times and any non-fastball were excluded, mostly because for non-fastballs, it's not always about velocity. Sliders and curveballs typically involve a lot more with movement than velocity, and changeups typically involve velocity off of your fastball. There's way too many other factors that go into high quality of pitches for non-fastballs. And typically when we discuss velocity being the be-all end-all, it is the fastball that tends to be part of that discussion. So at the end of the day, even with those restrictions, that still give us 650,000 fastballs thrown over the last 3 years by pitchers that threw that pitch at least 500 times. And it is spread out between starters and relievers who pitched often enough to qualify. With all those pitches and all those pitchers, I found each pitcher's average fastball velocity and then separated their pitches into 3 different buckets based on that average. The average bucket, every pitch thrown at least 1 mile an hour greater than their season average, and every pitch thrown at least 1 mile an hour less than their season average. That indicator was mostly done to make sure that there was enough pitches in those buckets to really make for a solid study. And as by choosing 1 mile an hour as the cutoff, about 20% of the fastballs ended up being faster than the average bucket, and 20% of the fastballs ended up being slower. leaving the other 60% in the middle, which I felt was a viable enough number that still gave us about 125,000 pitches in both of those outlier buckets to really get decent value out of the analysis, and especially a value out of each pitcher, because that still gave us about 100 or so pitches on average for each pitcher to be analyzing here. So just to give an example of like how these pitches were divided up, I give you Nathan Eovaldi here. And these pitches on screen came from his start in Game 5 of the World Series in 2023. Now, here, his fastball average velocity was 95.1 miles an hour. And since we're all including playoffs, these pitches are in his buckets. The bottom three four seamers would be in the greater than one bucket because they are at least 1 mile an hour greater than his average. Those 96.4 and 96.6 is there. The four fastballs on the top of that table there, 77 through 80, would be in the average bucket. Now, his splitter's not a fastball, so that's not included. And he only threw 400 cutters, so pitch 81 also would not be included either. Like I said, there are some pitchers that do have multiple fastball archetypes, and I included specifically four seamers, sinkers, and cutters, all as fastballs, regardless of how a pitcher used them. But for this study, each of those three would have their separate averages and their separate buckets in order to keep things fair so that we're not comparing cutters to four seamers directly. Now, with all of that data taken into account, I wanted to look specifically at four different command metrics. How often the pitches ended up in the zone, how often they ended up in the heart, how often they ended up in the shadow, and how often they ended up in the waist. And all four of those came from Baseball Savant's definition of the strike zone, which you see on screen here. In general, pitches thrown in the heart of the zone are typically not great for the pitcher. Yes, they are almost always strikes. They are 100% of the time they are in the strike zone, but often they are in the part of the plate that gets hard contact. In fact, those 71 home runs that I showed earlier all came on pitches in the heart of the zone specifically. Most often, that little rectangle there directly in the middle where the baseball is would probably be considered meatballs by most fans. So often you're actually trying to avoid the heart. And you're definitely trying to avoid the waist zone, as it's defined specifically as the zone where a pitch is so far away from the strike zone that the batter is basically just going to auto take it every time. They are, by definition, a waste. Where you really want to aim is the shadow of the zone, because as you can see, it's kind of in the border between being in and out of the zone. Often the hitter's going to do one of three things. They're either going to generate soft contacts, and typically it's a lazy fly ball or groundouts. They're going to just swing and miss the ball completely, or foul the ball, which both cases would be a strike, or they're just going to take it. And while part of the shadow zone is a ball, by definition, about 25% of the balls in the shadow zone are accidentally called strikes, incorrectly called strikes, by the umpires. So you can sometimes still get positive value for a pitcher by throwing it out of the zone but in the shadow. And obviously, if you throw it in the zone in the shadow, it's a strike. In terms of individual pitch value, the shadow of the zone is the best for the pitcher. So for this case, I'm looking at how often did the pitcher hit the shadow, because ideally that is the goal for command. How often did he avoid the heart and the waist, because the more you avoid them, especially for waist, you get better outcomes that way. And then in general, I did want to include in zone percentage as kind of a more default, is it in the zone or not? Because obviously, if it's in the zone, it's a strike. It's kind of a baseline metric to include as part of this. I did not include the chase specifically because it's kind of in that gray area in the visual, literally. But in terms of player development, somewhat figuratively, as you're not aiming for the chase zone more often than not. The name of it specifically is to try to get pitchers to swing and miss, but there's a lot more that goes into that. So I decided to avoid chase and focus just on heart, shadow, and waist. So for each of those four command metrics, I ran an ANOVA test on the three buckets. So the average velocity command value, the greater than one velocity command value, and the lower than one velocity command value, in order to test if the mean value of those three buckets was different or not. And I decided to set a pretty aggressive p-value of 0.01 because I wanted to be absolutely certain that there was something significant going on here. I also created box plots for each of the four to determine what means might be different if the test does return that, yes, there is one that is different. So, what are the outcomes of those tests? Well, we're going to start with the one test that ended up not being significant, and that was in zone percentage. It wasn't off by much. The p-value was only 0.019. So, in some fields, that would actually be considered significant. But for this study, it is not. And if you look at the box plot, you can kind of see why. Most of the average in zone percentages are around that 55% mark. And one thing that might jump out at you that will become a bit of a theme is that for the outliers, there is a much wider range of outcomes. You see here that the box plot boxes for the fast and slow outliers are both longer. The box themselves are a little bit wider. There are fewer outliers. The outliers are a little bit more extreme, especially for the slow outliers in terms of the very little in zone percentage there for those bottom dozen or so points. And that is really the big thing that jumps out at me at when it comes to this box plot. And you're going to see that as a trend going forward as well. But at the end of the day, the end zone rate is not greatly affected by having a random pitch that's an outlier velocity. It's a little bit more significant for the hard. It does drop under that 0.001 value, p-value, although only barely. And the difference, again, comes from the decrease in options for the average velocity, where there's a lot more range of values for the outliers, in particular, less heart, which is honestly pretty good for the pitcher, for it to end up in the heart less. Although what they're replacing it with is not as good. Because if we move on to the shadow percentage, you'll see that it's a lot. Again, it's somewhat strong, kind of about the same as the heart in terms of its significance. And this is where we start to see a lot worse outcomes for those outliers. The means for the fast outliers in particular are less than the average. The low range of outcomes is worse than average. There are some outliers that do significantly better, but at the end of the day, we do see less pitches in the shadow of the zone, especially for those faster outliers. For the slow outliers, it's not as much of a factor. We kind of still see just a wider range of averages around the average velo. The one that really stuck out to me was waste because this had the strongest difference, the strongest significance. And the big thing that sticks out to me here is just how much greater the fast outliers have in terms of their waste percentage compared to the average. Because its mean is greater than average, its third quartile is significantly bigger than average, and wastes as high as 12 to 13% are still within the range of not being an outlier, which 12 if you're a waste percentage above 10% is not good. Again, these are pitches that are so bad that the batters are essentially just going to auto take them every time. And seeing that large of an outcome, and even see with the slow outliers, although not to the same extent, there's still a lot of very high values compared to the average. That this plot right here really jumped out at me when I was doing this study in terms of how much the command declines in terms of the increase of waste pitches. So my conclusions here is that there are really the biggest outlier velocity impact is just the wider range of outcomes. Now there are fewer pitches in those buckets compared to the average, so that is somewhat to be expected. But even with that taken into account, I expected there to be less of a wide range of outcomes than there really was. But at the end of the day, throwing harder or slower than your average doesn't lead to more pitches in the zone, but it does have at least some impact on your pitch value because you're throwing more waste pitches, you're throwing fewer shadow pitches, and to a lesser extent, you're throwing more heart pitches, which in turn, your value does go down. So Mike Rizzo may have actually had a point. And it turns out, perhaps, maybe he was onto something, because in 2024, the Nationals ended up being one of the best teams in baseball in terms of allowing walks, as they just missed out on the top 10 after one more year of pitcher development. Maybe the guy who's won a World Series has a decent idea of what it takes to win on the diamond.